Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rachel. I'm a senior qualitative research mentor here at Statistics Solutions. We are a full service dissertation assistance company. Really, we're here to help with any phase, any stage of your dissertation research and writing. So this webinar is writing your qualitative results chapter. I do have Isades here with me. She will be helping out with some tech support in the event that anything goes a little wonky and answering any questions that you have. Everyone is in listen only mode. If you have questions during the presentation, you are welcome to go ahead and pop those into the questions box, and Isades will field the questions that she's able to during the presentation, and then we should have time at the end of the presentation to get to a question and answer session. Okay, so as questions arise, go ahead and put those into the questions box, and we will get to those either during the presentation or at the end of the presentation. So again, I'm Rachel. I'm Senior Qualitative Research Mentor here at Statistics Solutions. This is the Writing Your Qualitative Results chapter webinar. So I want to cover the basic components, what goes into the qualitative results chapter today. So we'll touch on each of these items as we move forward. And this is a bit of a compilation from some different universities that I've seen and what goes into a typical results chapter. So certainly your own university might include some different sections. There may be sections required that you don't see here. There may be extra sections that you see here that your own university doesn't require. So there is some flexibility there, but I've sort of pulled this together from information from several of the universities where clients that I work with most frequently come from. Okay, so introduction, setting, demographics, data collection, data analysis, results, trustworthiness, and summary. Those are sort of the main kind of headings or sections that you'll see in your results chapter, typically your chapter 4, although it may be, depending on your school or the type of dissertation that you're writing, may be a different chapter number. So in the introduction, you just want to reiterate the problem and purpose of your study. And really the best way to do this is verbatim from the problem and the purpose that you've introduced in your proposal in chapter 1. If you have it again in chapter 3, you don't want to go changing the wording or anything, but you do want to remind the readers of what the problem was, what the purpose was, what you were trying to do with this study, what your goal was, and kind of move on. Remind the readers of your research questions, which questions specifically, and again, these will follow from your research problem and your purpose, right? That will all have been nicely aligned as you worked on your proposal. So this is just a reiteration of all of that. You're here to remind your readers, kind of take their hand and hold their hand and walk with them so that they're with you as you move along. And then you want to preview the chapter. Okay, what are the main sections in the chapter? How's the chapter going to go? Just hit those highlights so that your reader knows what to anticipate, what's coming next. The setting section is really where you conducted your research. Okay, so you'll talk a little bit about that setting. Is it an organization? Is it a school? What's that site where you worked, and why? Why was that setting the most appropriate for your study? A lot of this, you'll notice, overlaps some with chapter 3 because you did talk a lot about this in chapter 3. Here is where you talk about any discrepancies between your chapter 3, the in an ideal world, here's what I will do in my study. And in chapter 4 is the here's what actually happened and why. Okay, so to an extent, this is a little bit redundant, but you do want to remind the readers of what your setting was, why you chose that setting. Were there any conditions that influenced your research? I am willing to bet that a lot of you right now working on your dissertations, no matter what stage you're at, are going to be influenced by the pandemic that's happening right now. That's totally normal. You and every single other graduate student is in the same position. Okay, no doubt it will influence your research. So you want to talk about that some, right? You know, if you had to do interviews via Skype instead of face-to-face in person, that's totally fine. But you talk about that here, okay? So conditions that influence your research, conditions that influence your participants, right? It might be something to do with the setting. It might have something to do with, again, the pandemic. So anything that influenced your participants, their participation in your study, okay? Really, anything that may have impacted your interpretation of the results. That's what you want to talk about here. You know, were there changes to the study site, for example, than what you anticipated in chapter 3? And what were those changes? And what do you think the impact that they had was? This is where you get to talk about all of that. And I'm going to back up here a little bit because one of the most commonly asked questions that I get when my clients are working on their chapter 3 is, well, what if it doesn't go according to plan, right? And I think that students often get really hung up on that to the point where it can be kind of a barrier in the writing process. And, you know, it happens with things like the setting or data collection. You know, what if it doesn't go? Because you haven't conducted your research yet. So you don't necessarily know. This is all like a hypothesis, right? In a perfect world, this is how it's going to go, but it never goes the way that you plan. That's really the only thing that you can plan on. And so this is where in chapter 4, these initial sections really kind of before you get to your data analysis and results, this is where you can talk about that. You can talk about what was different, what changed, okay? Maybe, you know, the changes introduced some limitations, and you can cover those in your chapter 5. But I guess my overall point here is don't necessarily get hung up as you're working on chapter 3 about what could go wrong, right? Or what could go differently than you expected, because something ultimately will. And you just cover that in chapter 4 and you move on with your life. Okay. Demographics. You want to talk a little bit about your participants, any relevant information about them. Is it relevant that they are men or women? Okay, is it relevant that they are between the ages of 40 and 49? Is it relevant that they have 15 plus years of teaching experience? Anything that is relevant to your study that makes a difference. Okay, it's nice to have this outlined. I like to do this most often in tables. So, you know, there could be some sort of narrative presentation of this, but also tables are really effective at communicating demographic information. It's just a nice visual snapshot for your reader to see. And certainly, and I'll highlight this again later, but certainly if you use tables or figures, anything like that, you will want to discuss what is presented in those in the narrative. Okay, but a table can really nicely present demographics. And sometimes, depending on your study, the nature of your study, it might be important to present a sketch or a profile of the participants. Okay, maybe you're doing a case study or a multiple case study where each person represents a case. And so you want to kind of dive a little bit deeper than just, you know, their age and their gender and how many years they've been the executive manager of a, you know, some organization. And this is perfectly appropriate to do too. You know, you'd give them a pseudonym. It could be a participant number. It could be a name that you came up with or a name that they came up with. And you do want to always remember the piece about maintaining confidentiality. So you want to provide sufficient depth, certainly, of that participant profile while still remaining cognizant of the fact that you need to not include anything super private or that would identify them to someone reading your dissertation. So most often then the next section, and we're sort of starting to build to really the meat of this chapter, okay? But you talk about your data collection. How many participants did you have, right? This number might vary, again, from the number of participants that you said would be in your sample in chapter 3. Okay, so who did you collect data from? What participants? What was the location? Where did you collect your data? The frequency of data collection. Did you conduct one interview with interviews? Did you conduct 3 different sets of observations of a classroom? Okay, all of that information can go in here. And really the goal is just rich description. You want your reader to really clearly understand what you were doing in your study, okay? How your data were recorded, right? So did you use technology, right? Did you use some kind of recording device, audio, visual? Did you have an observation checklist where you were perhaps counting the number of times you saw a particular behavior? Okay, talk a little bit about how you recorded your data. And again, this is where you're going to talk about any variations from the plan that you presented in your methods chapter. So again, you've already in chapter 3 outlined all of the data collection. You've outlined your research site and setting. You've outlined who your participants will be. Okay, this is just reiteration, right? So these sections are not the bulk of your results chapter. So you don't have to focus on them as much as your data analysis and your results and presenting your results, but you do want to touch on these. Okay, and then anything unusual that happened in data collection. And so again, right now, of course, my go-to, something unusual is that we're in the middle of a pandemic and it's kind of messed up data collection for a lot of people. That's okay. So we talk about all of that in this section on data collection. And again, as I said at the beginning, some of these sections may not be applicable to your own results chapter. Some universities don't require these, they simply want the results and for you to move on. And that's fine too. But these are most commonly the sections that I see that reviewers and schools want. So we're starting to get into the bigger sections here. And the data analysis section is an important component of your results chapter. That said, sometimes, depending on the school, depending on your chair, you will see this section in chapter 3. Okay, but your data analysis section in chapter 4 differs a bit from data analysis in chapter 3 because you have your data now. So you had your plan for how you would analyze your data outlined in chapter 3, but this is where the rubber meets the road. This is how did you apply your data analysis plan to your specific data? Okay, so let's say that you have a batch of interviews, semi-structured interviews from 8 participants, okay? And you're using a thematic analysis for those. You want to talk about how you applied the analysis to those interviews. Maybe you had document analysis and you're using some kind of content analysis. Okay, talk about how you applied the steps of content analysis to your documents. Okay, so you can do this using, little excerpts to show exactly how you moved from the coding process to the process of larger categories. Data analysis, qualitative data analysis, is all a process of data reduction. So this is where you want to be very clear about how you reduce the data into the core, sort of depending on the data analysis plan, if those are themes or categories or superordinate themes, they can be called different things according to the different design of the data analysis. But you want to very clearly show how your analysis moved from coding to categories, breaking down those data, okay, finding, examining, pulling out the categories, the patterns in the data. Okay, and I say here identified and generated. there's nothing emerging. You as the researcher are the one who is actively engaged in this process. So you are generating these patterns. They are there in the data, right? But it's your job to make sense of them. This is also the section where you'll probably want to talk about any discrepant cases or negative cases and how those factored into your analysis. So discrepant cases or negative cases are those that are very different from what everybody else has said. So say you have your 8 interviews and 7 people all had the same experience and the same feelings about one experience. And your 8th participant had a completely different sort of, making sense of that experience. What do you do with that? Well, it's important, right? Clearly there's a pattern that's happening, but someone has a different idea about it. So that shows some variation. But here you want to talk about how you factor those in. Okay. And when you present your results, you'll talk then more about what that means. Okay. So really in this section of your results chapter, you move from what you do with your raw data to the coding and categorization, okay, the data reduction, and just do that clearly. Remember, think about holding the reader's hand all the way through so that they can follow your thought process and understand how you got from point A to B to C. So the presentation of the results, this is really the bulk of your chapter. Okay, and again, there are schools that I have seen where this is the only thing that will go into your results chapter. It's only presentation, okay? But again, school specific, it might be chair specific. So you do want to check that out before you go running into the drafting of this chapter. But the presentation of your results. The organization of this section can vary, and it really has to do with what makes the most sense for your research questions and for your data and for your design, okay? Sometimes if you have, for example, a one-to-one situation of one theme addresses one research question. So say you have 3 research questions and you have 3 themes or 3 categories that you discovered in your data analysis, it might make the most sense to organize this section based on research question. Here's my research question 1. Here is the category or the theme, whatever that is that addresses that research question, and then you present that. Okay. In other cases though, and perhaps more likely, if you have 3 research questions, there's a good chance that you would have more than 3 categories or more than 3 themes. And so in that case, it might make the most sense to present your results by category. Okay, and so you could say, category 1 or theme 1 is X, Y, and Z, and this partially addressed research question 1. Okay, and then you move into the presentation of the results. So your organization of this section can vary a little bit, and it's just what makes the most sense. In presenting your data and presenting your results, you want to use mostly your own words. And I think this seems sort of obvious, but then when we are so immersed in our data, we tend to forget that we shouldn't just throw a bunch of quotes from participants onto the page and let them speak for themselves. Okay, you want to use mostly your own words and use supporting quotes from participants or excerpts from documents. You might, if you're doing something that is more visual, you might take photographs and use those from observations. Those should support the assertions that you are making in your own words, right? So the bulk of it should be what you are writing, okay? And then support that with your data. You want to discuss your data, and I have here interpret if appropriate. Okay, so certainly you discuss your results. And I think one of the really kind of easy ways to do this is, if you have category 1 or theme 1, starting off with this theme, here is what it's about. It's based on, these quotes, and then you talk about all of that. The interpretation, though, generally comes in chapter 5 or your discussion chapter. Okay. There are some cases, though, where you would present the interpretation of your data along with your results. If you're doing an interpretative phenomenological analysis, okay, which is a specific type of qualitative design and analysis, then you would interpret your data alongside the presentation of the results. Okay, but usually it is a presentation of the results, and then you hold off on the interpretation and the discussion until your discussion chapter. Okay, and again, the presentation of your data should be logical. It should be clear to the reader. And I will say this again, because this was really drilled into me when I was working on my own dissertation, is think of holding your reader's hand, guiding them along. Okay, so that they don't have to flip backwards and forwards in the document, scroll to different pages. You're constantly reminding them, showing them what you're doing and why. Okay, so it should really make sense. So back to this idea then of discrepant cases or negative cases. And as I said before, these are those cases or those instances, really. Maybe case is not quite the best word because I don't want this to get confused in with case study or case study language. But these are instances or situations that appear to disconfirm your major findings. So what that means, again, is that if you have 7 participants that all experienced a situation in the same way, and you have one who had a very different experience of that situation, this is still important, okay? And it may be not the case that it disconfirms that finding or that pattern. Certainly 7 out of 8 would be a pretty interesting pattern, but it might provide you with an alternate explanation. Okay, what might be going on with this participant that they had a different experience? It can illustrate variation of the experience, right? Certainly in most qualitative designs, we're looking at some level of patterning and convergence around topics, around ideas, categories, but this isn't always the case. We know that people experience situations very differently. So it might illustrate that variation. And so it's a good idea then to discuss these instances in the context of the category or the theme. Okay, so while it might be the case that you have one participant who is totally different in every single way from your other participants, it's not likely. And so it might be the case that they fit within the pattern of most of your other themes or your other categories that you've identified, that you've generated. But if there are 1 or 2 categories or themes where they don't, then this is where you would talk about them within those specific categories. Okay, but they're important and they're interesting, right? Because they lead to, new ideas and new hypotheses to test and new research questions and avenues for future study. Visualizing your findings is not a section of your chapter 4, certainly, but how you want to highlight your results, how you want to talk about your results. And in qualitative chapters, this most often comes in the form of a narrative, okay? But it can be nice to supplement narratives with appropriately placed tables or figures. You might have maps if you're doing an observation of a classroom, and it's important for understanding the results that your readers understand the layout of that classroom, you might map that out and include that in the chapter in the presentation of the results. So, any drawings that might be important as well if you're doing something that's a bit more visual. Okay. The only sort of caveat that I would say here is you do still need to describe them in narrative form when they appear in your results chapter. So you can include tables and figures, maps, drawings, what have you, but you also need to explain why they exist in your chapter. So the last section that, again, I see often required by schools is that of trustworthiness. And like some of the other sections toward the beginning of this presentation that I touched on, this is another one that you often see in chapter 3. And so again, here it's a little bit redundant, but also this is where you get to highlight what was different from what you proposed in your methods chapter. And so you want to touch on probably the 4 sort of cornerstones of trustworthiness. So credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. Okay, and there are multiple avenues to establish these, and there are certain methods to establish each of these 4 that overlap. So for example, triangulation can help establish credibility, but it can also establish, say, any of the others as well, or member checking, okay, can help establish not just confirmability, but also credibility, for example. But you just want to talk about, I wouldn't in this chapter go into what each of these 4 aspects are, but what you want to do is talk about how you establish them in your own study, and if anything differed from what you proposed to do in your methods chapter. Okay. So this is where you get to describe how you established trustworthiness of your data. So this is all well and good. You've got the major sections, right? But you still have total writer's block and you don't know where to start. Okay. And I see this a lot because it can feel so overwhelming. It has maybe been a couple of months since you wrote your proposal. It's possible that it's been a couple of years. That's typically what I see. That is very, very common. So you're not even really in the habit of writing regularly anymore. Maybe you've just kind of forgotten how to do it altogether. It's hard to get back into that routine, really. And so there's the feeling of, this is so overwhelming, where do I start? And it's a different type of chapter because this is where you're talking about your own data and your own results. It's not just, synthesizing maybe what you've read in 100 different articles, which is a totally different type of chapter, right? So where do I start? You don't have to start at the beginning. You do not have to start with your introductory paragraph to your results chapter. In fact, that might be easiest to write if you come back to it after you have worked on some of the other sections. Okay, so if you are having trouble getting started writing because you don't know how to start that introduction, forget about it for now. No one says you have to write that first. Okay, you can start with a smaller section or start with a bigger section. Okay, this is, again, just depending on how you're feeling. There's no rule. Nobody is going to tell you what you have to start with. This is all up to you. If you are having just a real bear of a time getting started, start off with maybe your demographics section. It's information that's all readily available. You've probably got all of your participants' demographic information at the start of their interviews, for example, and you can just make a table and just start putting that together. And it's something that you will need to do anyway at some point. it's not going to take a lot of thought, right? A lot of effort. So it's the low-hanging fruit here, but it's still getting you to the goal, right? You still have something tangible on paper that you will feel is an accomplishment, okay? If you are feeling really good about where you're at, start big. You can start with the results section. Start with the data analysis section. You know, these are, like I said, these are the real bulky sections of your results chapter. So if you're feeling good, you can jump in there. You know, start talking about your results, okay? Just a couple of other pieces of advice that were really, really helpful for me when I was working on my own dissertation is do not discount the power of free writing and brainstorming. Maybe you spend some time outlining each day, okay? But what I found very, very handy was to go into a quiet area. I had an office. I was fortunate enough to have an office. So if you're, you know, if you're lucky to have the same, I encourage you to take advantage of that. But if not, that's okay too. But I allowed myself to free write. And what I mean by that is with no censorship whatsoever. I didn't care if I misspelled words. I didn't care if my sentences were grammatically correct. I didn't care about any of that, but I would just free write on whatever I was thinking about related to my data and my results that day. And I would do this for 15 minutes a day, uninterrupted. So I turned my phone off. I was in a quiet area and I just let myself go. And whatever came to my brain went down on paper. Writing is thinking. Writing is thinking on paper. Okay. And you would be surprised at how much traction you can gain, how many pages you can write in 15 minutes a day. They are not all going to be good, but you will have something to work with. I guarantee it. And again, 15 minutes. You'll feel like you have made progress. You have something tangible to show for your work, and you may have some spark of inspiration that will lead you to get started with one of the other big sections of your chapter. Okay, so I really, you know, I encourage you as you are, if you're struggling with this writer's block and how to get started with your results chapter, remember, you know, a lot of us, I think, are perfectionists. It's part of why we're pursuing a PhD. Don't be. This is a chance, you know, just don't be, just free write. Let yourself go, okay? And you can really accomplish a lot. In the summary section, it looks like I swapped these two slides here. So in the summary section, you just want to provide the highlights of your findings, okay? And maybe you link those again to how they addressed your research questions. Paint a picture of what you found, okay? What were the key sort of highlights or take homes from your findings? And then you want to provide that transition to the next chapter, what you're going to talk about in your discussion chapter, right? And again, summary, certainly it comes at the end of the chapter, but oftentimes these are the summary and the introduction are kind of best left until the end, because then you have all of your thoughts on paper, all of the sections done, and you know exactly what you need to hit in your intro and your summary. So again, my name is Rachel. I'm a senior qualitative research mentor here at Statistics Solutions, and we are a full service dissertation consulting company. So we are here to help you, provide you with timely support for your dissertations, anywhere from topic development and chapter 1 all the way through with chapter 5. We provide assistance with your IRB, and we also provide a complimentary 30-minute consultation. I encourage you to register for that if you are struggling at any stage of the dissertation writing and thinking process. Okay, you can do the complimentary 30-minute consultation. We can get a better sense of your own unique needs related to your dissertation, and we do qualitative and quantitative support as well, so it's not just qualitative. We can help you determine what you need, work with timelines, you know, to really support you through the whole process. So that contact information is available here. I'm going to open up my questions pane now. And take some questions and answers. So I have one question. Can we discuss correlation between the findings and demographics, if there are any, in qualitative research? So the question has to do with correlation between findings and demographics. I would probably encourage you to stay away from discussions of correlation in qualitative research. Certainly this is something that we find more frequently in quantitative research, but we don't have any good qualitative statistical measures, right, to be able to talk about are our results correlated with a particular demographic. So I would probably stay away from those discussions. The next question is it appropriate to count frequency or conduct statistical analysis of the themes, like how many participants mentioned a specific theme? This is a great question. And again, this comes back to your reviewer or your chair preference. This is one where I have seen some schools and some chairs do want to see how many participants contributed to the development of a theme, or how many codes went into that theme. I have also seen reviewers say absolutely not, no numbers in your results chapter. So I would check with your chair, check with your reviewer to see how they want it presented in your results chapter. This is one that, yeah, like I said, unfortunately I can't, give you a totally firm answer because it does depend. And then are there other questions that I can answer on your qualitative results chapter today? We covered, quite a few different sections. And we will be providing a recording of this for attendees, so you will receive that probably within the next day. I don't believe it includes a PDF of the slides, but you will get the webinar. The next question is, in this section, will we be discussing how we approach the data, for example, grounded theory approach, or is that a better fit for the method section? Right, so this is another one where most often I see the data analysis or the approach to the data, like grounded theory, discussed in the results chapter. And especially grounded theory, I think, because it is so iterative and reflexive, and data collection work and data analysis are so closely tied together that you kind of have to talk about all of it at once. But yes, this is where you want to talk about how you applied your data analysis to your specific data. So it's not just the roadmap for the analysis anymore, it's here's what I did to my data to get these results. That said, I know that there are some universities that do want to see that in a different chapter, for example, in your methods chapter. Clients that I've worked with in the UK or Western Europe, for example, oftentimes I've seen that their chairs want the data analysis in the methods chapter and not the results chapter. But I would say most often I see it in the results chapter. And what other questions would you like answered this afternoon? If there are final questions, you can go ahead and type those into the questions box, and I will get them answered by reading them out loud and then answering for everyone. Okay, I don't see any further questions. So again, I'm Rachel with Statistics Solutions. The information about us is on this final slide and it's also in the chat section. So don't forget, you can schedule a free 30-minute consultation to talk with us about your own dissertation needs. Okay, and we will be sending out a copy of the webinar for everyone tomorrow. So thanks for joining me this afternoon. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.